Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Wiggfall, the Legislative Director at Social Security Works, and welcome to our May office hours. If it's your first time here, welcome. We hope that this time is useful and an opportunity for you to learn more about what we're doing in real time here at Social Security Works. If it's your second or third time here for office hours, welcome back. We're glad you were able to join us again. As always, I want to start with a few reminders. One is if you have not started your SOAR lesson yet, don't fret, there's still more time. SOAR will be offered all year long, and so at your own pace, you can take our SOAR course to learn more about how you can help protect, strengthen, and expand Social Security through advocacy. If you have started and you haven't finished yet, again, it's okay. You can keep going at your own pace because, again, the course will be here all year long. Second, if you ever have any questions, do not hesitate to email us. We are always available to answer your questions and happy to do so. You can reach us at soar@socialsecurityworks.org if you ever want to reach out to us and let us know your comments, your questions, and concerns about the course. This month, we want to talk during our office hours about the legislative process that's coming up in the summer and how you can be involved in making sure that when bills are introduced to expand Social Security, you're there to push those bills forward in the House and the Senate so that eventually they will be signed into law by the president. So let's talk a little bit about what that process even looks like. We've heard from different members of Congress that they are intending to either reintroduce bills that they've introduced in the past Congress or introduce new ideas that they want to input into the legislative atmosphere. And so we are always supportive of that and excited to see the ideas that members of Congress come up with, sometimes even based off our own suggestions or suggestions that they hear from their constituents like you. And so, again, we expect that to happen sometime this summer. When members of Congress get those ideas, the first thing they have to do is turn that idea into legislative language. And so they will work with a team of legislative counsel, people who are real experts at how to write law, and they'll come up with a written version of the idea that they have. Once they have the written version of their idea, they take that written text to the House or Senate floor, depending on which chamber they serve in. The clerk will issue a number for that piece of legislation, and then we take that legislation and push it as far as we can. It falls into the regular legislative process that you're familiar with. So it'll go to committee. After committee, it can go to the House or Senate floor. It'll go to the opposite chamber, again, to go through the committee and the floor process. And then if it's passed in the same fashion by both chambers of Congress, it can be signed into law by the president. And so our goal is to really move forward as much good policy as we can during this time, because we do have a lot of champions in Congress who are ready to pass good pieces of legislation. So next, we want to go over how you can be involved in that process, because while it sounds simple to just take something that's introduced in Congress, move it through committee, through the House floor, to the president's desk, it's not quite as simple as that. There is a bit of a process for bills and ideas to really gain popularity. That's a really important part of the process, is to make sure that the ideas that we want to see passed in Congress they have buy-in. We have to have support from House and Senate leadership, for example. Committee chairs have to be supportive of the ideas that we want to see passed. Sometimes it takes members from both parties to be supportive of these ideas for things to get passed. And so that is where constituent advocacy is so important. As a legislative director, I go in and talk to these staff members and sometimes members of Congress about their ideas and why we think that they are important as an organization, but I cannot understate that it is so much more important for constituents to go in virtually, of course, at this point, to talk to staff and members of Congress about what you want to see done. And as you've learned in the SOAR course, that can happen through emails, it can happen in letters, it could happen on social media, it could happen through a phone call, just any way you can think of to reach to your member of Congress and make sure they understand that you support these pieces of legislation. It's just so important for that process to happen in order for these bills to progress through Congress. And so that's what I want to talk about or talk through today, because again, we know there are going to be pieces of legislation that you all want to see passed, and we want to make sure you have the tools to really advocate for those. So the next thing that we should talk about is the opportunities that you have, again, to be involved in that process. And so one of the things that you can do, and I think it's one of the most important things that you can do for pieces of legislation, is to gain co-sponsor support. So when a member of Congress, again, has an idea, they take it to the House floor, often they have the support of many, many, many of their colleagues. And their colleagues can publicly state their support by becoming co-sponsors of legislation. So what that means is that a certain member of Congress, they will introduce a bill and be the primary sponsor, but every single other member of Congress who publicly supports this idea and wants to see it passed can be listed with the original primary sponsor as a co-sponsor of the legislation. So if, for example, your member of Congress has not stated, you don't know where they stand on a particular piece of legislation, if it's unclear what they think and you want to know, one of the things you can do is ask them to become a co-sponsor of a piece of legislation. So one thing that I want to go through today is a screen share where I actually show you how to find who co-sponsors what legislation, because it's really simple to find. It's public information, but again, often it's not fully utilized to the power it should be. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, and I'll make it larger so that you just see my screen. So if you go to congress.gov, which is really the best place you can go to find anything about what's happening in Congress, all you have to do is type in the name of a piece of legislation. So for example, I know that the Social Security 2100 Act is a very popular piece of legislation. Please note that it has not been introduced in the 117th Congress, which is this year's Congress, but it was introduced last year and it had a lot of co-sponsorship support. So I'm going to go over here and click to just look at the 116th Congress. And again, that was the Congress for 2019 and 2020. Here on the screen, you can see that the Social Security 2100 Act was introduced in both the Senate and the House. The information right on the front of the screen tells you who is the primary sponsor for this piece of legislation. So you see that Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut was the primary sponsor in the Senate, and Representative John Larson from Connecticut is the primary sponsor in the House. And we expect that they will continue to be the primary sponsors of the same legislation, which could be slightly different depending on what they decide in this Congress as well. So that's something to be on the lookout for this Congress. But as far as co-sponsors go, you'll see that in the Senate, this bill only had one co-sponsor. So we're not going to look at that list because it's not as interesting. But if we go down to the House version, you'll see it had 209 co-sponsors. That is a lot of support. So if you click on the 209, you'll see that you'll come to a page that just is about the Social Security 2100 Act in the House. And you can scroll down and see all of the members of Congress who supported this piece of legislation. And it's so long that it might be easiest for you to look by state. So we'll go to Virginia, for example. I live in Virginia. And I'm looking at this list and I see that Congressman Beyer is a co-sponsor, Congressman Connolly is a co-sponsor, Congressman McEachin, Congressman Scott, and Congresswoman Wexton were all co-sponsors in the last Congress. Now, let's say I lived in a different district in Virginia and my member of Congress is not on this list. That is when it's up to me to make a difference and to call my member of Congress to make sure that they understand that I support this legislation as a constituent and that I want them to be a co-sponsor of this legislation. Now, there are a couple exceptions to who will become co-sponsors of legislation. And so I would just want to explain those so you can keep them in mind just in case you live in one of these districts. So if you live in California, in Speaker Nancy Pelosi's district, I think that it is absolutely important for you to call her office and tell her that you support pieces of legislation like the Social Security 2100 Act or whichever bill that you find important. But you should note that the Speaker of the House probably won't become a co-sponsor. And that is really just a matter of their leadership position. The Speaker of the House doesn't want to, unless in very particular circumstances, they usually don't want to be biased toward pieces of legislation that they haven't written and it's not their idea. And so they tend to stay out of the discourse of co-sponsoring legislation. And that's okay, because you can still call their office and find out what they're supportive of, the ideas that they support. And so again, if you live in Speaker Nancy Pelosi's district, absolutely call her office. And you might find that they will tell you that she is very supportive of doing whatever the thing is that you're calling about, but she may not co-sponsor the piece of legislation, and that's okay. The same thing often applies to, not always, for committee chairs. Sometimes if a bill is related to Social Security and the committee chair doesn't want to take a side either way, they won't become a co-sponsor of the legislation. And again, that's okay. But it is still worth it to call and to tell them how you feel. The other situation that you should note is if you live in a district that's represented by a party that, as a party, they do not support a particular piece of legislation. So that's a really good example with the 2100 Act. And I'll add the screen back so you can see this. If you look at the entire list, so we'll exit out of Virginia and see the entire list. In the top left-hand corner, you'll notice that all of the 209 co-sponsors here, they're all Democrats. So that tells you that, well, Republicans don't really support this legislation. Now, that doesn't mean it won't pass the House. It will make it much more difficult to pass the Senate, but that just means that if you live in a district that's represented by a Republican, your member of Congress may not co-sponsor this legislation, but it is still important for you to call their offices and to tell them that you want to see them support things like this, because it gives them an idea of, maybe I should start to think about getting involved in this space. Social Security, again, if you've read through our polling memos, is supported by people in the United States across the political spectrum. If you talk to Republicans and Democrats, no one wants to see Social Security cut. Everyone wants to see it strengthened, protected, and even expanded. And so the more that Republicans in Congress hear from their constituents that they want to see these things happen, the more we will slowly see the changes in Congress. And again, that change may be slow, but the change can still happen. And so it's important to do those things and to be involved in the legislative process to push these things forward, again, to gain co-sponsors And the more co-sponsors you get for a legislation, the more likely it is to come up on the House floor. So if if the speaker can see that a piece of legislation is getting like wide support across their party, or even getting bipartisan support, that might make them think a little harder about making sure that bill comes up on the House floor. Same thing with the Senate. If Leader Schumer sees that a piece of legislation is getting really wide support across the political spectrum, then he's probably more likely to bring that to the floor to actually receive a vote. So again, when the pieces of legislation come out, the number one thing that you want to do is make sure you're advocating for more members of Congress to co-sponsor that piece of legislation. And that can happen through calls, emails, letters, social media, however you've learned and want to do that through our SOAR training. The second thing that you can do is sign a petition. Oftentimes, if you all receive our emails from Social Security Works, you'll see that we have different petitions on our website or through our email. And signing those petitions is really helpful for us because the more people we see support a piece of legislation, the more we can tell members of Congress and congressional leadership that this bill has a lot of support. So we can do that obviously through our polling. We can do it through the stories that you all tell us. But there's nothing like taking a list of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans to the Speaker's office and saying, Speaker Pelosi, for example, we have so many people who support this piece of legislation. It would be great if you would be behind putting it on the House floor. Or going to Leader Schumer and saying, Leader Schumer, so many people support expanding Social Security. We have to bring this to the Senate floor this year. So I encourage you, if you are not currently on Social Security Works mailing list, I want to show you how to do that. So I'm going to switch back to the screen share. And if you type in socialsecurityworks.org, which you should be familiar with because you've come to our SOAR page at this point and registered for the course. But if you go to socialsecurityworks.org and slide down to the bottom, you'll see this first petition that says expand Social Security, sign the petition to expand Social Security. Once you sign this petition here in the bottom right-hand corner, then you'll be on our mailing list for Social Security Works at large, and you'll get to see a lot of the petitions that we send out on a regular basis. So if you haven't done that, I'm sure a lot of you are on our mailing list, but if you haven't and you're interested in receiving our emails, please do that. And you can be more involved in getting signed on to petitions throughout the year. The last thing that I think is also really important, but maybe sometimes forgotten, is that you can ask your friends and colleagues and family members to call your member of Congress and make the same ask. So, for example, if a member of Congress gets one call from you asking to co-sponsor a piece of legislation, they'll keep note of it. Their staff will say, we got one call today about you co-sponsoring this Social Security expansion bill. If they get 10 calls, though, all of a sudden their ears might perk up a bit and they might say, oh, well, what is this piece of legislation that people are calling about? So always remember that you have so much strength in numbers by getting more than one person to call and to ask about a particular piece of legislation. And I really think it doesn't take much to get some members of Congress on legislation. So just be encouraged as you're continuing to do this work, whether it's you, whether it's a group of friends. Continue to call, continue to write, and slowly but surely, we will see the legislation we want to see passed in Congress. So the last thing I wanted to show you is our page on socialsecurityworks.org with legislation. So I'm going to add the screen back. And again, this is our homepage here at Social Security Works. So socialsecurityworks.org/legislation. If ever you want to see the legislation that we have endorsed at Social Security Works, you can come to this list. So we endorse a number of things, and as you'll see, they are not all Social Security related. But if you are interested in seeing all of the bills, Social Security and otherwise, please come to this page. It is very simple to see the name of the bill. You can see once you click on the green plus sign here on the right side, exactly who introduced the bill. We'll go to Social Security Fairness Act since that's one of the very popular pieces of legislation. So you'll see who sponsored the bill. So for example, with this bill, Senator Brown and Congressman Davis introduced this particular bill in the House and Senate. You'll be able to see the bill numbers. You can click on the bill numbers and they'll lead you to the congress.gov site where you will learn more about the bill. You'll be able to see the text of the bill. And then also you'll see a short summary of the bill. So not a thorough analysis or anything, but a short summary. So for example, this bill would eliminate the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset, which we know is very popular amongst this group. And then we give a short description of why we like it. And so we do that for, again, most of the bills that we have endorsed. I continue to keep this updated throughout the year. If there's a bill that you think should be on this list and is not, then by all means, please reach out to us and say, hey, we saw this bill that was introduced by someone, or we've heard of this bill, or anything like that. Please reach out to us and let us know that you think something might be missing off of our list, or you maybe it hasn't been introduced yet and it doesn't have a number, and that might be why it's off the list. But just reach out to us and ask, and we're happy to share all of that information. If you ever want more information, like more details and specifics about the bill, we're happy to give that as well. So again, this is important because this is the crux of our work, is really advancing these policies, making sure that they pass through Congress, and making sure that eventually the president will sign a bill to protect, strengthen, and expand Social Security. So I hope this run through has been helpful for you. Again, if you have any questions, you should always feel free to reach out to us. I'll put the email address up on the screen one more time. It's soar@socialsecurityworks.org. Also, a reminder that you all can tweet with us on Twitter @SSWorks, and you can also share our posts on Facebook. We are Social Security Works on Facebook.com. Thank you so much for joining us for our May office hours. We look forward to seeing you all in June. Take care.